All right, Griffin, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in Europe or Canada or Mexico. We had about 150 registrants from all around the world. I'm Scott Atwell. I'm the Senior Vice President and Co-Practice Area Leader for the Alumni Relations Practice at Grenzebach Lear & Associates. And I'm joined by my colleague and fellow Senior Vice President and Co-Practice Area Leader, Barney Ellis Perry. We welcome you to this session of strategic planning, a critical tool, of course, for any organization, but especially for those with very large constituencies. You know, when I first got into the alumni relations business over a decade ago, one of the real legends of the profession gave me some sage advice. He said, Scott, there is no shortage of good ideas, only the people and resources to implement them. So if you don't have a strategic roadmap, you can easily feel as if you're on a hamster wheel, working hard, but getting nowhere. We're going to try to solve that for you today.
And nobody wants to be on a hamster wheel. Hi, it's Barney. Our goal in this webinar is to give you practical advice about how to start a strategic plan, complete a strategic plan, and implement a strategic plan. Lots to do. This webinar application allows you to send us questions. We'll try and answer them as we move along, but promise to do so before we end. You'll notice there's a little question button at the bottom of your screen. You may have seen this in the promotional copy, but we designed this outcomes of this webinar to allow you to do the following. Learn the individual steps to strategic planning, realize the power of mission, vision, and values, discover the necessity of an environmental scan, learn the components of a strategic goal driven by metrics, incorporate design thinking within your strategic thinking and in your work, turn a strategic plan into a work plan, and understand how to complement your development colleagues and other key constituents in your organization. While Scott and I consult in the alumni relations practice specifically, well, actually we probably do quite a bit in development as well. We recognize that over 40% of the folks who signed on today are not in alumni relations. So we welcome you, those folks who work in museums, healthcare, and the arts, and other great organizations. And we hope our advice today is delivered in a universal context that everyone can use in their organizations.
All right, before we get started, a little something about GG&A and our practice. We're a team of 3, including the incredibly talented consulting associate, Megan Williamson, who works out of our Chicago office. Barney is based on the East Coast. I'm based, he's on the West Coast. I'm on the East Coast. Megan's right in the middle. Yeah, so we're very geographically balanced.
Balanced from the perspective of the clients we serve. Here's a listing of the organizations with whom the alumni relations practice has partnered within the last 5 years, and you'll see they span the globe. Constituent relations and philanthropy are worldwide interests, and GG&A is a worldwide consulting firm.
All right, and a little sense of the work that we do. Of course, customized alumni program reviews and recommendations, and strategic planning. Since we're doing a strategic planning webinar today, that would make sense.
Every aspect of our lives is measured these days, but alumni and similar constituent relation programs are just getting their arms around understanding how to quantify the work we do. Thus, our practice is knee-deep in the conversations about the metrics and often the outcome metrics in engagement. But this is also very applicable for organizations with large memberships and hospitals with grateful patient programs, etc. Our work does not go out the door without some form of data component. We are extremely data-driven. And for that, we have a great analytics team who do design and conduct surveys. They do great benchmarking studies, and they do a lot of data crunching. We also provide ongoing counsel for our clients to achieve the recommendations that we may have delivered in a study. In addition, we also do training and workshops. And finally, we advise on dual goal campaigns, which is an emerging area, something I've been involved in for many years, where we elevate the non-monetary engagement goals right alongside the dollar goal. Again, this is becoming, a new area in alumni relations, but it's also applicable in other areas. Yesterday, I was in Minneapolis meeting with a large bone marrow transplant organization, and they have a huge base of potential bone marrow donors. And so we were having a conversation about could they have a dual goal, which I think is a really exciting idea.
Now, in a few minutes, we'll be talking about the importance of the mission statement, and here at GG&A, we have a pretty good one. It's in the bottom left. Our mission is advancing yours. So let's get started with a pretty simple concept. Where do you want to end up in this process? As consultants, we've learned that many organizations are doing things without really considering what they're trying to achieve. So before starting a strategic plan, you really need to ask yourself, where is it that you want to go with it? Or as Stephen Covey says, begin with the end in mind. He is, of course, one of our great business leaders, a guru of sorts. But with regards to this advice, he has a formidable peer, because a long, long time ago, the legendary thought leader Winnie the Pooh advised us to make sure that we know what it is we're looking for. And I think they're pretty much saying the same thing.
My hero, Winnie the Pooh. So how does this apply to our discussion today? Let's consider the reasons you may need a strategic plan, because each of these objectives may very well require that you tack in a slightly different direction. If your organization is looking at undertaking a large campaign, that's often a big catalyst for strategic planning across an organization. And whether it's at the beginning of a campaign or at the end of a campaign, and specifically for those of you in alumni relations or membership, your most important work may very well be in that period between campaigns when the pipeline for the next campaign has to be developed and the importance of your work is elevated. Another driver might be new organizational leadership. This can be an incoming president or chancellor, a new vice president, maybe a transition even within the leadership of your department. With change comes new priorities, and that can be a difficult conversation if you're already in the middle of a 5-year plan. Sometimes this requires you to stop and recalibrate. Flexibility is super important. Another area, and if we pay any attention to the stock markets, we might get nervous, budget cuts can also trigger the need for a new plan to clarify your goals, streamline your processes to meet your priority goals. The future is always going to be a destination. So how do you chart a new course to get there? As consultants, we spend a lot of time speaking with colleagues who worry about the decreased investment in alumni relations enterprise. Now more than ever, we must demonstrate value. As you will see, the planning process is a way to tease out a narrative that's useful for your chancellor and other leaders who sometimes don't quite get the long-term value of the work that we do. Strategy itself is a reason for planning. The impact of technology is forcing us to think of things in new ways. As practitioners, we need to direct resources in new and innovative ways to support our objectives. Finally, does anyone out there have board members who do not understand their role? Boy, then you really need a plan, because this process can illustrate to them how they can be an asset to your organization, and I love this, with their noses in, but with their fingers out of the process.
All right, let's talk about stakeholders. If constituents don't believe they have ownership of the plan, then it is likely to fail. So consider your audience. For alumni professionals, wow, it includes the alumni body itself, especially volunteers. You have the aforementioned university leadership, which must also include all of the vice presidents. You have the team that does the work, your association staff, the academic deans, students, faculty, non-alumni, perhaps even the community, because our institutions are such an important part of those communities. There are a lot of mouths to feed, and a plan that is handed down from a small group of leaders will not have ownership. And I'm reminded of a term that I stumbled across in graduate school called the reluctant bureaucrat. Essentially, it describes the low-level worker, maybe at the state level, who must implement the rules and laws created by a legislative body. The reluctant bureaucrat, if he or she doesn't agree with the rule or the law, can drag their feet, ignore the process, and essentially subvert the legislative action, because a law is just words on a piece of paper. Someone has to carry it out. You will have more success if constituents believe they've had a voice in the process.
Completely agree. So let's talk about the timeline, which is a good time to offer a disclaimer. There is no single way to undertake strategic planning. There is many ways to do it, as there are people watching this webinar. We have chosen today a middle of the road process, and that's not because I'm Canadian, with the understanding and even encouragement that you have the license to mix and match. As consultants, we never present a one-size-fits-all approach. The work is always totally customized. That said, this isn't instant coffee, or in the South, instant grits. You can expect to simmer the process for 6 months to a year, but these are the basic steps that we will cover today. Discover, retreat, ideate, and implement.
Well, by discovery, we mean assessing where you are as an organization, not just where you think you are as an administrator or staff member, but where others think you are. Essentially, this is a scan of the environment, and it is one of the most useful exercises you'll ever go through.
The retreat phase is an effective planning process includes a manageably sized committee or task force that goes off to do some serious deep thinking. consuming the information that you've found in the discovery phase, and talking about where they want to go next. It's all about imagining.
Then the rubber meets the road in the ideate stage, crunching the big ideas and arriving at a handful of concrete priorities that will guide the work of the organization over the next 3 to 5 years.
Finally, there's implementation, turning your strategic plan into work plans that are measurable and accountable. So again, feel free to send in questions as we go along. The first stop on this joyride is discovery.
You know, George Bernard Shaw gave us some great advice when he said the biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And this observation is at the heart of the discovery process. You know, in our lives, we know people who tend to give us their opinion too often, but the truth is, as humans, we are often afraid to articulate exactly what we're thinking, which is why the environmental scan is such an important tool in this process. It helps the organization find a common language with constituents. And let me say that while you can conduct strategic planning on your own, and the tools we're giving you today will help you in that process, this part of the planning is really where the value of outside counsel comes in, because the fidelity of responses will always be higher when a third party is asking the questions, especially if the interview subjects have something critical to say. And if you don't hear what others are honestly thinking, it's going to be difficult to craft a plan that addresses organizational challenges so they can be turned into organizational opportunities.
Here's a few ways to do this. By organizational assessment, we mean review the structure of the team, the volunteers, budget, performance metrics, and programs to understand where the priorities currently lie. It is always vital to start with a larger context, the institutional strategic plan. Next, a SWOT assessment is a great way to dig into the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. More on that in a minute. Then it is face-to-face leadership interviews with the president, vice president, board, executive, staff, and other key stakeholders. That might include your donors and other key folks in the community. 30 minutes to an hour each with a set of common questions that will illuminate priorities and tease out really strong observations.
Well, the next box is a gap analysis, and that can come out of the face-to-face interviews, but it can also be done as an electronic survey to capture more data. We use a product that allows anywhere from 100 to 200 respondents, and the results can look something like this. Essentially, the process allows the stakeholders to say, hey, look, this is what matters most to me, and this is how you're delivering on this priority of mine. And I should also point out some organizations prefer to survey all constituents with an alumni attitude survey. There are a lot of products out there that deliver a statistically relevant result. And I can tell you that GG&A has a survey lab team that conducts alumni surveys more economically than just about anyone. The last box there is the board self-assessment, which is especially useful if you're having difficulty getting your volunteers to fly at 30,000 feet and stay out of the weeds. And all of that is then aggregated into a situational analysis report. This can seem a little overwhelming, a little daunting. You might be asking the question, do we really have to do all of this? The answer is no, but it's all about the level of fidelity to which you aspire. If cost, if time are not issues, then all of this is useful in capturing the truest picture of an organization, but the client must always be the one who decides what level is required.
I'm going to take this opportunity to answer a question from Don Dreyer. Hi, Don. The question is, what do you do if you are not sure who your stakeholders should be? Doesn't that need to be addressed prior to discovery? Yes. The stakeholders are super important, and what you think, it sounds sort of dumb, but you may want to be keeping a list as you're even starting to think about your strategic planning and the folks that you want in the room. I like to use the term, what's your perfect room? Who would be the ultimate scenario to have in that room? So you want stakeholders, not all of whom are drinking your Kool-Aid. It's really important to think about folks that might be that sort of disruptive agitator that is maybe some critical of your organization and can really bring some, an interesting alternative thoughts. You may have folks that are just incredibly passionate about what you're doing. And then you may also want to have a few folks that have, they've seen a few rodeos, so they're going to bring that optimism for your vision, but also they may temper that with their experience. So think very carefully about that. And no matter what your organization is, think deeply across that organization about the folks that can really help you push your new strategic plan forward when it comes to fruition. I hope that answers the question. So let's jump into the SWOT here. So we'll look at this a bit more carefully. I'm sure each of us have gone through some process like this at some time or another. The strengths and weaknesses are usually internal forces, things we can control organizationally, while the opportunities and threats are usually external forces, but not always. What we'd like to do is code the responses and distill them into a single word that helps to visually express sentiment in a word cloud. Of course, we also provide the details of the responses, but this shows how quickly you can assess the consensus. If you look at the top left, it makes sense that passion would be a strength for an organization. But in the bottom left, this organization, for example, can do a better job at collaborating across campus or with other organizational colleagues. This exercise helps to understand where the organization is at this very moment, but also where it can go. If you use it, make sure that the salient points are turned into action as part of the priorities that you will eventually be settle upon in your strategic plan.
All right, next up is the retreat phase, which we mean both literally and metaphorically. Retreats, of course, provide an opportunity to step back and ponder philosophically about the organization. The data has been gathered, and now we start to distill it into its finer essence with a strategic planning committee that we are going to sequester in place where total focus can be applied. We talked earlier about the fact that one size does not fit all. How big should your committee be? We've seen them as large as 75 or as small as the executive committee. It really depends on how your facilitator manages the group. But a working retreat is going to provide a useful setting to do the following work we're going to describe in partnership with the planning committee that you select.
Just to reiterate the point about the planning committee or task force, whatever you call it, also think about the other key influencers that you might want in the room. So if you're in alumni relations, maybe have some of your development colleagues there. If you're in development, you may want some of your alumni relations colleagues there, because ideally you're setting goals that you may also have. If you're an alumni, you may be setting a development goal. Again, if you're an alumni, you may want to have student recruitment. That might be an important part of the institutional strategic plan. If you're in a museum or art gallery, it might be your membership folks. So just think about that perfect room. So the beginning of the committee or task group retreat should focus on setting a vision. And our advice here is to think big. Albert Einstein himself suggested that your vision should be so grand in its scope that some might call it absurd. Absolutely love it, because that is where you're going to capture people's imaginations. Think about how this plan can be inspirational for your key folks. So let's start with a vision statement. This is one sentence that describes where you want to be when the strategic plan you're working on reaches its conclusion. If you don't know where you're going, as Yogi Berra said, you may end up somewhere else. The vision statement is a crystal ball that looks into the future. Here's a few examples. The National Multiple Sclerosis Society, a world free of MS, just 5 words. The Nature Conservancy, to leave a sustainable world for future generations, 8 words. Habitat for Humanity, a world where everyone has a place to live, 10 words. You see how these statements are an end in themselves. These organizations are envisioning a day when they go out of business because their work is no longer needed. I can't tell you how many vision statements I read where the text is present tense, explaining what needs to be done instead of articulating an aspirational end.
And so if the vision statement is looking down the road, the mission statement is examining the present. It's been said the most important question you can ever ask is why, and the mission statement explains why your organization exists, hopefully in one sentence. We'll have more on that in just a moment. Now, this is a good opportunity to engage the planning committee in an important exercise around the question of why. Going around the table and asking first why they're involved with your organization, and then going around again and asking why does the organization or the institution want you involved? The 2 why questions from 2 very different perspectives.
The reason this is important in the alumni space is because we often find organizations with an imbalance in this equation. Our alumni relations practice is currently working with a client in Europe who has tilted all of their resources to what the alumni population wants, with no regard to what the alumni can do for the institution. At the same time, on the other end of the scale, we often hear from alumni who say the only thing the institution wants from me is my money. So the optimal space in which an alumni organization should operate is in the middle, with what we can call mutually beneficial relationship. Why are the alumni or blank constituents involved? Why does the institution want them involved? Those two answers meet in the middle for success, in our opinion. Oh, sorry, I thought I was over to Scott. There's actually a formula for this mission statement, and here it is. Action plus targeted beneficiary equals mission. Nice and simple. In more practical terms, why you exist and who you exist for. Now it's Scott's turn.
And for non-alumni folks who are out there, this is where you can also add in additional components of your mission through the services provided or the problem solved, the cause, or others with whom you partner. But caution here, remember, the definition of the mission statement required that it should be in one sentence. How many of you seen in your lifetime where the mission statement is 2, 3, 4 sentences, a paragraph or two? What are the chances of anyone in your organization remembering something that lengthy? And if no one can remember it, how can it be actionable? So our advice for the mission statement is simply simple. It should fit on a t-shirt, and your volunteers should be willing to wear it. Think it can't be done? Well, let's take a look at a few examples. TED, how many of us enjoy watching those TED Talks? The mission statement for TED is spreading ideas. 2 words. How's that for an economy of words? The Humane Society, celebrating animals, confronting cruelty. 4 words. The Smithsonian, the increase and diffusion of knowledge. 6 words. Monterey Bay Aquarium, to inspire conservation of the oceans. The Wounded Warrior Project, to honor and empower wounded warriors. Do you see how this follows the formula? The actions for the Wounded Warrior Project, the actions are honor and empower the beneficiary, wounded warriors. So today we're throwing down a challenge to see if your mission can come in under 10 words. GG&A's mission, our mission is advancing yours, just 5 words. If you can get it within those confines, you can do so much more with it. You can put it on the back of your business cards. It literally can become a calling card for your organization.
Okay, so let's step back for a minute and look at all this from a strategic level. You can see on the pyramid where the vision and mission form the leading edge of your work. The meat of the plan, goals and objectives, are still to come. But along the bottom, the entire structure has a foundation built on values. And that's our next exercise. Core values should describe the collective attitudes and beliefs you desire. The key word here is desire. So think about your organization. What do you believe in? This can be a very interesting conversation. Here's a list of potential values. We could create 10 more lists this size. The idea here is to get you thinking.
And here's a way that this idea can be actualized in the context of some of the other things we've talked about. We had a client go through an environmental scan, and one of the things we uncovered in that process was a concern about the commitment of some board members who attended meetings sporadically, maybe indicated they would attend an event and then didn't. So during the retreat, we had the opportunity to introduce this concern in the form of stating a new value. And here's some of the words that we considered. I don't remember which one was chosen, but it started a conversation around the idea of holding each other accountable. And through that conversation, the board members agreed that they were comfortable with a fellow volunteer holding them accountable for what they said they would do. It was a way for the board to take ownership of its own actions. So the staff no longer needed to call anyone out. The board said, we are willing to do this on our own. So the value statement can speak to the qualities you desire in your organization even if they don't exist right now. That indeed is progress. Going back to the mission statement, we do have a question from Tim about whether or not we have examples of mission statements from colleges. We don't have any in this webinar today, but I could tell you the ones that I've seen over the years are very lengthy, and they need to be reduced in their scope, and they really need to be more focused. Tim, I could give you the one that we used at Florida State University, and the mission was to advance our university's greatness and enrich the lives of the Seminole family. So advancing greatness, enriching lives. It could actually be reduced to 4 words, and we in fact had that on the back of our business cards. I found it to be very, very actionable in the work that we did. Barney, over to you.
Well, actually, I think while we're at it, why don't we answer a question from Leanne? What are your top questions to ask an organization in the midst of strategic planning? Wow. So one of the things that in doing your environmental scan, it's really important that your questions are similar with the different folks that you're talking to. So usually we distill this to, maybe 20 questions maximum. And by having it consistent, then of course you can compare it across everyone you've spoken to. The real crux of it is what you're trying to get under is what's working really well in their view. So what are they impressed by? What do they think could be done better? But a question, I was just doing this with a client in Oregon, and the question I really liked was, if you had an unlimited budget and you could write a check to, change and support the new strategic plan, how much would that check be for, and what would it be for? And that really created some great conversations. The other theme of some of the questions is, what's in it for you? Are you getting what if you're a department head, what your department needs from this, folks who are doing the strategic planning? Really, trying to get a sort of out of the context of the organization doing the planning and getting under the skin of the folks who rely on that organization for support or for constituent support, whatever it may be. And Leanne, if you want to talk further about that, we're happy to chat later. Okay, so we're going to transition from the philosophical to the practical. The rubber is going to meet the road in the next section we call Ideate. This is where those big, scary, audacious ideas are generated. I like to use the design thinking rubrics. It lays the foundation for a flexible, creative approach to your strategic planning. And as you'll see, we do the empathize part, which is conducting the research, that's your environmental scan, and then pulling all of that information together in the define stage, and then providing that information to the folks who are going to do the ideation. So that's where we're at now. But what's cool about this is it's all about being creative, but based on research and testing ideas, knowing that some are going to fail. It can also be a great framework for your ideation conversations. And there's no one way to do it. I do say, and maybe this is a bias, but when I was leading organizations, I always like to have a facilitator so that you as a leader can think and observe. A good facilitator can work with you to create a structure for your retreat that is fast and dynamic, pushing people's thinking. You've recruited the perfect room. You've got really smart people who represent a wide variety of views. So you need to think super carefully how you're going to use their time and really push their thinking. Ideally, your participants have been spoon-fed the research and work that has been done prior to the ideation session. For example, we often suggest that people send out a nice, manageable amount of information every Friday for 2 to 3 weeks prior to the session that folks can read on the weekend, because a lot of these folks are volunteers. Design thinking can be, you want to curate the group carefully and be very mindful about the dynamics and agendas of each participant. And I'm serious, you may actually want to really think about who's sitting at what table and even where. The goal is to really work the group hard and truly problem solve and develop exciting solutions and vision. You want participants' brains to hurt at the end of the day. Literally, you want them to be exhausted. A great way to do this is using time-boxed creative sprints, and that's going to include 10,000 yellow stickies, because you need to push people past their top initial 3 ideas. Those are the comfortable ones. There's some great stuff coming out of Stanford right now about this process, and pushing people to come up with literally like 100 ideas. Give me your top 200 ideas. There's no coffee break till we have 200 ideas out of every table. That's where you get the really cool stuff. Then it's all about distilling the best ideas and agreeing on which ones to invest in and to test. Another fun idea is having a graphic facilitator. This can be really engaging for the folks in the room, because as the conversation is going, the graphic facilitator is recording that, and they're seeing this very visual piece of work, start to be built. The resulting diagram can also be a great way to share what came out of the session with stakeholders and key folks who were not there. I remember presenting this to the university leadership board, and they were just wowed. It's also great to have in your final report. You may want to even put it up in your office, and many of them are dynamic, and you can add to them to show your progress in years following. Okay, any more questions? Here we go. From Don again, improving the lives of adult learners. Oh, no, there we go. That's a good example of a college. Improving the lives of adult learners, University of Maryland, University College. Okay, Scott.
All right, now it's time to take all this that we've been talking about and use the materials as building blocks to construct an actual strategic plan. And I just want to say that this is your license as an organizational leader to question all the great ideas that come your way, and it allows you to say, wait a second, is this something that falls into one of our strategic priorities in the strategic plan? This is your get out of jail card coming your way. You may have heard the phrase, if everything is important, then nothing is. Indeed, the definition of important is literally something that stands out as significant or profound. The strategic plan is built to block out all of the white noise in our professional lives, to help us focus on the things that are important. Now, all the work we've done up to this point, the environmental scan, the vision, mission, values, design thinking, you should have identified 3 to 5 important and profound areas in which your organization should focus. So here's a look at one framework for articulating a strategic priority. And again, there are many variations of this. We encourage you to mix and match to fit your unique needs. We also suggest that in your final document that you include a glossary of the key terms that you've settled on, because there's not a single nomenclature. You want to make sure that your stakeholders have a clear understanding of the language that's being used. So with this column, at the top is the strategic goal or priority. It's the big picture. It's the goal that will help you reach your organizational vision that we talked about earlier. Since the goal is a brief sentence or just a few descriptive words, we find it useful to add some context with a goal statement. And we'll be giving you an example of this in just a minute. The objectives box is for a list of the ways that we pursue the goal. And these, in fact, can be quantifiable items. Tactics, of course, are the specific actions that accomplish objectives, and their measurements will tell us if we're succeeding in the pursuit of the goal. Now, all of this is very basic, and you may be asking, what am I learning here? Well, here's some value for you. It's the slide you want to show your board of directors, illustrating the 30,000-foot level from which they are expected to manage, because I promise you it's not always self-evident. I just heard a story about 10 days ago from an alumni director who was telling me about some board members who routinely call up staff to make requests for initiatives that they are pursuing individually, and how it created anxiety among the staff because they don't want to disappoint their board members, but they're also very confused about who it is they work for. So as we mentioned earlier, noses in, fingers out, these blue shaded areas are where the board is allowed to sniff around.
But they got to keep their fingers out of the tactics. So let's give you some real life examples of this. One of the questions coming in about how do you make sure the ideas are practical? And this is where you're going to see that. So some real life examples are, here's a pretty common goal in alumni organizations: increasing the ability to track engagement outcomes. That's a brief description. Stating that goal in more detail may look something like this. Counting for the sake of counting is not a strategic goal. We will create a system that identifies and measures desired outcomes of our alumni engagement. Okay, so how do you do that? You need objectives. Here's some examples. 1, include an engagement metric and capital campaign, such as a dual goal campaign. 2, create a campus partnership that enables you to track all alumni engagement, i.e. collaborating across your whole institution, which may be putting engagement data into a variety of different databases. And again, this applies for hospitals and museums and other organizations. Establish a 5-year goal with incremental benchmarks in your time period. Identify desired outcomes and protocols for tracking what it is we want to achieve and how do we measure it. So this process is going to really shake out those ideas that are not practical, because this is where you're going to, they're not going to have any life left in them if you can't do these things. If you can't measure it, you can't have a time period, and it doesn't work for your key partners. That's where the board or strategic planning committee's work should end. After that, staff should have the free rein to decide how it can accomplish these goals and objectives based on its understanding of the unique limitations that are present, and every organization has limitations. Then, in conjunction with the board or committee, there should be agreement on how the progress towards this particular goal will be measured. In this case, because the goal is about measurement, it's a measurement of the measuring. Gotta like that.
Yeah, Barney, this bottom box is very critical because, if you're not careful, all of the boxes above that one will keep the staff busy with the appearance of getting things done. But the only way you will actually know you're getting things done is through the measurements that you choose, and those should articulate outcomes, desired outcomes. So that box at the bottom looks small in size, but it is huge in stature, and you must return to it often. Let me switch gears here to say that I've seen strategic plans that are so detailed and voluminous that they can be overwhelming to look at, especially for staff. And that's why I find it helpful to give a timeline to some of these outcomes. So on the bottom right here, take a look. For instance, it's okay to say, this objective right here is incremental. That's something we can get done this year. These next two are going to take a little bit more work, maybe next year. And then getting the president to buy into this dual goal campaign, that's transformative. That's going to take a couple of years of labor leading up to the campaign's public launch. What this allows is your staff and yourself to take a breath and celebrate incremental victories along the path of achieving your vision. If you use this column approach to your strategic plan, your committee should land on 3 to 5 of columns that look just like this. Any more than 5, and you're approaching that place where everything seems to be important, and it's going to be difficult to find success.
So this leads us to the final phase of planning, the implementation. By some estimations, 90% of strategic plans fail because of poor or no implementation strategy. And I've seen that rodeo a few times. As we mentioned earlier, your plan has been created within the context of a larger institutional plan. So think of your plan as cascading down from that larger institutional plan. Think about how it links both ways, to and from other units, development, student services, maybe member services, patient services, all those different things. And to ensure accountability, it needs to continue to cascade down into actual unit and individual work plans that can be measured and monitored on at least a quarterly basis. This is where, in an ideal world, and I know there isn't always enough resources, that you have a person assigned to project management, at least for a tiny percentage of their job, so they can set up the structure and monitor the results. Ideally, they organize stoplight meetings once a month or a quarter where you review the progress, and we call it stoplight because you review the progress with a green, amber, or red light by each tactic, keeping the whole team accountable. Another really important thing to do, and to really leverage all the effort you're putting into your strategic plan, is to share it. Think about how you can leverage the strategic plan process to engage key constituents with your journey towards seeing your vision come to fruition. The creation of the plan is an opportunity to engage stakeholders far and wide. The president once told me that she believed that she had to share the plan until she was so sick and tired of hearing it, and only then did she realized that people were just starting to hear it. Once the plan is complete, share it with all involved and with all your key constituents. Think of every single possible campus or hospital or organizational committee you can get in front of. Be relentless. After year one, you want to ensure you circle back to your stakeholders and share the good news of your success, the challenges, and potentially the failures. It's important to be transparent and acknowledge that not everything went to plan, but really celebrate your successes. Ensure you tailor the message for each audience so it answers what's in it for me. If you're proud of your plan, put it on your website. You'll be amazed by how many people download it and read it. And that's also a really great resource for your board so they can scramble before board meetings and refresh.
Well, we have another question from Dawn. She's asking, how do you handle disagreements between the board and staff regarding tactics? And Dawn, the answer to that question, in my view, is that the board should not be involved in tactics and deciding what the tactics. Again, they have to fly at that 30,000-foot level. Their responsibility ends at the objectives, and then only you and the staff can decide what the tactics are going to be, because they're not in the office every day with you working. They don't understand your capacity. They don't understand the other obligations that you have. They don't understand, that they may have some idea of the budget limitations if they in fact have to approve a budget, if they have that fiduciary responsibility. So they ultimately have control over those tactics in that regard. But I think that you simply have to push back and say, look, you've given us this strategy. It's our job as a staff to decide the tactics to meet that strategy. If at some point in time we're unsuccessful in meeting it, then you have the obligation to review my work. And certainly ultimately there's some responsibility that has to come back on you. But that's the role they should play. That's where they should fly. And if they give you pushback, then you just have to push back as well.
In the nicest possible manner. Let's answer another question from Karen Franklin. When timelines are not met, what is the contingency plan? This is why the stoplight meetings are so important, because there you're looking at the progress that's being made and thus the timeline. And that's where you can, if something's got an amber light beside it, which is a warning sign, you as the team and the leader of the team can strategize, what is the correct timing? How do we, readjust? There may, the future is never clean and linear. There may have been, some big initiative come from leadership that you've had to drop everything and scramble to meet. There may have been a crisis within your organization that could even be external. You could have had protests. You could have had, some horrible media report. So it's really important to, personally, I love to see monthly stoplight meetings. And so you're just continually staying on top of everything. Another important thing to do, I think, is to have, Monday morning check-ins with your whole team, even if it's a 20-minute stand-up meeting, and people can say, what's important timelines need to be met that week to keep the whole team accountable. And again, if you want more conversation about that, we're always happy to chat.
Dawn had a follow-up on her question about the tactics. She thought that we had said that the tactics would be shared with the board. It was the measurements that the board and the staff would agree on, not the tactics. I think that the board does have some responsibility. I'm sorry?
No, I was just going to say, and the tactics would be shared with the board, but as an FYI.
Yeah, as an FYI, the staff actually gets to articulate them and then find some agreement on what the measurements of success will be. All right, so finally, we call this presentation the strategic plan for the strategic plan, so we had to deliver. And this is the cheat sheet for everything we've covered today, is the strategic plan. You could make an argument that all four of these columns could be objectives under a single goal of designing a strategic plan, but that would create a very vertical column and we'd never get it on the screen. So as a practical matter, we've listed it this way: plan and scan the environment, articulate culture, identify priorities, and implement strategy. And each has their own goal statements, objectives, tactics, and measurements.
A couple of specific points. Communication of the process is vital, as we mentioned. One of the very first things we mentioned in this presentation is the need to bring the entire constituency along for the ride. Even if they don't participate, they must have confidence in the process if you give them an opportunity and give them updates as you go along. You must be very specific in explaining why you're going through the process and what you want to achieve and the role they can play. All of your steps should be transparent and the final result communicated. Again, communicated.
Now, the actual working group, of course, is smaller as the process gets more granular As Barney mentioned, you have to get the right people on the bus. You have to get their commitment to meet in person at a retreat. Joining by phone, I'm sorry, it just doesn't work. Been there, done that. It's very, very hard to engage someone by phone. So if that stakeholder can't be there in person, select another one who can. Obviously, a doodle poll or some kind of survey on the date location would be imperative.
This working group will have a lot of information to process. Data from the environmental scan, the relationship to the vision and mission statements, design thinking, all of that. Don't take your eye off the ball. It is intense. This process started with a goal. You got to end it with a goal.
And finally, as we mentioned before, the strategic plan has a reputation for being created with much fanfare, only to be placed on a shelf and never seen again. But here's how you keep that from happening. Make sure that every one of the tactics in your plan has a line item connected to your budget. Every organization has to formulate an annual budget. So when that time circles around each year, you're required to make a judgment on whether you're going to continue to fund that line item or replace it with something else. So in this way, the strategic plan becomes a dynamic living object that is contemplated each year in the budget, and of course, hopefully at least once a month in some sort of dashboard for your measurements. Another way to assure accountability is to designate a responsible party for each of your objectives. Not an area of your organization, but a specific staff member. That way there is never confusion about who has ownership of an activity.
Awesome. So any final questions? Type away madly if you have questions. Otherwise, we want to really thank you for joining us today. Please don't hesitate to contact us if there's anything you'd like to discuss in more detail, or if we can help you with your strategic planning or some other fun project. Any questions coming in?
This, of course, is going to be recorded, and we're going to distribute it back afterwards so you can share it later. And, of course, we're also going to share the slide deck with the final strategic plan as well. So thank you, and happy holidays, and please be sure to take some strategic time off before you start your strategic planning. Dawn's asking if we have a follow-up for this webinar. We don't at this time, but Dawn, we'd love to follow up with you one-on-one. Let's connect and see if we can answer any more questions. Our thanks to Griffin and Carly back in the Chicago office for helping facilitate today. And we appreciate you tuning in, and we wish you happy holidays and every great success in the coming new year. Take care, everybody. Awesome. Thanks, guys.